Welcome to the show. This is Michael Seeley, and this is my sports psychology podcast. I have a very special guest on today. I think you're going to really like this, especially if you are a cyclist. Also, if you are a very serious athlete trying to move up in your sport, trying to level up. I have Bob Mionske on the show today. He is a two-time Olympian. He got fourth place in the 1988 Olympic road race. He's also a former national champion, many other accolades. I chose Bob to be on the show today because we are friends. We go way back to the 1980s, did a lot of training and racing with Bob, and he always impressed me. He had a very aggressive style, very, very tough mentally. In fact, Lance Armstrong is quoted as saying, he'll do anything to get your attention off the race. He was great at that, really psyching people out and utilizing all his mental and physical capacity. So today on the show, we're going to be talking about how to level up in a sport, and I'll be referring a lot to cycling, to the categories in cycling, which is category 5 to category 1. 5 is a beginner, category 1 is elite level. So he made it into the elite level in cycling in just one season, and that's something that really impressed me about him, is he just rocketed straight to the top. So he's the guy to talk to today about leveling up, and he has a lot of insights about expectations and about sports psychology. You're going to love the episode. Bob Mionske, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mike. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have you on the show today. The theme I've been thinking about a lot lately, and the athletes that I work with, is this concept of leveling up and the psychological barriers of leveling up when you get from one category to the next, one layer to the next. You know, baseball player going from the minors to the majors. You see examples of some people just crushing it in the minor leagues, and they get to the majors, and sometimes they get booted back down. Like they just play really poorly, way below their abilities. And that's a phenomenon, I think, that can happen, and that there's a lot of, I would say, anxiety with athletes of leveling up, feeling this kind of imposter syndrome, things like this. And the reason really I wanted to have you on the show today, Bob, is, we used to race together. And what I remember is your, I'll call it, meteoric rise from starting out as a category 4. This is back in the 80s when they only had 4 categories. Now they have 5. Maybe they'll have 6 categories in cycling. But that one season, I remember you just shooting up through the ranks from, I think, Cat 4 to either Cat 2 or Cat 1. And I wanted to ask you, like, how was that, if you can recall, psychologically for you? Did you feel intimidated? Were there times of doubt, feeling like you didn't belong there? Things like that. So yeah, how did that go for you when you moved up so quickly?
Yeah, well, one of the things that you encounter when you're moving up, you are already probably been at your entry level competition for a while, and maybe that would be sort of the rubric. That's where you have to face the idea that you're competing against other people, and how will you do, and how do you feel about that? So I got a lot of that out of the way just showing up and doing the races, my first races. And I guess I had an advantage because I trained with guys like you and your teammates and other kind of older guys, older than you and older than me, that were accomplished. And which is an important thing. As parenthetical, it's an important thing. If you can become friends or acquaintances with better athletes, and they share their time and advice with you before you go into competition, then when you get in the competition, you'll know what your sensations are and how it's all going. You'll have a level of confidence. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we were doing these group rides that were really difficult, and the guys that we were riding with, they were in higher categories. So I had some idea that I could ride with them, or if I wasn't as strong, I knew what to expect. So when I first started doing the beginning races, I thought, well, I'm not sure how this is going to go. And it turns out it was extremely hard, because when you do a group ride, you tend to warm up, you might meet at a coffee shop, you're with some friends. There's some kind of entree into the difficult part. When you're doing a race, it's on the minute they shoot the gun. And that kind of took me by surprise in my first races. And I wasn't really good at meting out my effort. So I really did suffer in those very first category 4 races, probably more than I did in any other races, or at least to some extent. So, yeah, so those are some of the technical details around moving up. But psychologically, if you have low expectations or high expectations, but you're willing to just do what you can and see how it goes with that mindset, and that's kind of how I did it. I thought, well, I don't expect to do well. In some ways, when you rise up to a higher level, you are not expected to do well necessarily. You're just testing the water, so there's no pressure. So since there's no pressure, you can focus on the effort. And that was really kind of how I did it. I actually used that approach all the way to racing in the Olympics. First time I was in the Olympics, I thought, well, I have no idea what this is going to feel like, even though I had raced internationally with a lot of the guys. A lot of them I hadn't. And the guys that were expected to win and be the favorites, that they had everything to lose. A guy like me was glad to be there. I wanted to represent well. But I didn't feel the pressure first time I went. So it was very similar to going from a category 4 to a category 1, 2.
I see. So it's like, it sounds like for you, there was not a lot of internal pressure once you leveled up, because you were like, well, I'm just starting out here. I don't really have much to lose because I just made it up here. Whereas the guys who've been there for a while, there's a lot of pressure on them to perform because they've been consistent before, where you just entered the arena. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Do you think it depends on kind of the disposition psychologically of the athlete, of once they make it to that higher level? For you, it sounds like a really healthy attitude of like, hey, I don't have a lot of expectations because I kind of shouldn't. I don't have the track record here in this category yet. So why don't I just play around and see what I can do? But do you think that have you encountered in your racing athletes who were really intimidated by leveling up, where they would actually underperform because of nerves?
I think I probably saw some of the juniors. I started as a senior. I was already a couple of years older than everyone, and I saw some of the juniors that had a lot of talent and pressure and expectation kind of flail when they tried to step up. I don't know if that was just the physical or if it was the psychology of being one of the best and now being one of the pack. I already started out just thrilled to be able to be a part of the pack. So, putting a finer point on that, yeah, I had low expectations. I think that when you are able to do something, if you can exceed your own expectations and it's going well, you have to ask yourself, if you question, you think, wow, I'm doing better than I thought I would. I think that might be the wrong mindset. I think that you should be so focused on what you're doing that how you weigh up against the other competitors is a secondary consideration. In other words, you're just doing your best and you're trying to stay right in the zone. I mean, it would be an easier comparison to talk about ski racing or technical competition, where you're not really getting instant feedback from the other competitors. You're doing your best run, and then finding out how you rank. In cycling, you kind of have instant feedback. Some of it's brutal. On the other hand, an event can be several hours long, and you can always hold out hope that things will turn around, which is one of the beautiful things about bicycle racing. I know there's different sports and they have different attributes, but with bicycle racing, it's like a huge production, and you never know who's going to cross the line at the very last minute. Lots of things can happen depending on what other people do. So you always hold out some hope, unless, of course, you're dropped. And even then, you can hold out some hope that the group will slow up. If you see that you've been dropped and you're with a group of other athletes that are trying to catch back up, hope springs eternal that they'll all sit up and you'll catch on. And you can do that and have a great race. And you probably experienced that in your training rides. where you're hanging on barely. And then at the end, you feel like, wow, I did great. I'm feeling like one of the better guys. So that's a neat aspect of cycling. And I think that plays into sort of the psychology of catting up as well. It's a chess game. You use all these metaphors. You might be up against the ropes for a lot of it and then come around. I was recently watching a special about Greg LeMond, the great American bike racer, from the 80s and into the early 90s, who was a prodigy. He was as good as Pogacar is today, and maybe even Evenepoel. Obviously, he was also world champion, even younger, or around the same age.
Well, yeah, I think with Lamond, when he was junior world champion, and he actually, I think one of his big signs of being a great champion was that he entered races as a junior and beat seniors and was like winning Cat 1, 2 senior races when he was coming up. And so it was, there's some athletes, I think, that it's pretty obvious, like Armstrong was the same way, where they're doing stuff that's beyond what anyone had really done before. And so there's like kind of that watermark that they set, like, oh my God, like here's a junior who won a Cat 1, 2 race. And certainly we've seen glimmers of that, like you mentioned, junior cyclists who pull off stuff like that. There's probably a handful we could name right now that we thought that we're going to make it big time, and they kind of fizzled out as Cat 1, 2 seniors. But I think it is also, sport dependent, like you're talking about with cycling. You get that instant feedback while you're racing. And to one point I really liked that you said there was that basically when you have expectations coming into a race, sometimes if you set them a little on the low side, you might surprise yourself and get kind of giddy and go, oh my God, I'm doing way better than I thought I would in comparison. I think the trap really, when you're leveling up, is that comparison syndrome. Like I'm doing way better than I thought, or I'm not doing as good as I had dreamed and hoped for. So now my ego is kind of hurt. So it sounds like, kind of the thread of what we're talking about here a lot is expectations, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I think it's expectations and pressure. That's self-imposed. I guess there's kind of a magic involved when you're really in the zone. I guess if you're a long-time athlete, you have to come to grips with the fact that it becomes more like a job. If your athleticism is your avocation, if it's you still could run into this issue. And the issue is that when things are going well, when there's like a magic involved, you're getting better, things are falling into place, you have a certain energy around you. But that's not always there. Even for a great champion, that's not always going to be there. There's going to be times where they drop below. And the question is, do you measure your self-esteem and your interest in the sport after each event? And I think it's important. I remember having, those races where you were really in the zone, or watching other athletes that were in that spot where you could just see they were on fire and they were tearing it up. And how did they respond to that? You could see that they were happy. Naturally, they were winning or having great results. And then later you wouldn't see them anywhere. They didn't seem to have it going anymore. And I think one of the important things to consider is not being too hard on yourself when it doesn't go great, but also not getting too full of yourself when it does go great, because that, to the extent that you rely on that euphoria, you're going to be hamstrung, because you're not always going to get that. That's just not how the world works, and certainly not how sport works. So there's a kind of a normalizing that I would do over analyzing my results. And it was harder for me when I really, really did poorly. That was probably the hardest part to psychologically deal with. When I did really, really well, I didn't get that full of myself. Because, first of all, I usually had to make a pretty big effort. And I thought, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that again. Or just being a little longer in the tooth and realizing that's just not how the world works. You have ups and your downs. So as an athlete, I think it's important to remember why you're doing the sport and not just lay it all on the line like it's life or death, and that your self-esteem is going to be determined by, who you beat. So there's a normalizing that I did, which I think was beneficial. It helped me get through the doldrums, but it also kind of took a little of the luster off of doing really great when things really went well. You celebrate and you think, wow, this is amazing. But then the gravity and the reality would hit you that, well, there'll be another race in 5 days or 6 days, and do I have this form, or, where am I going to be? And so going a little deeper mentally, in terms of analyzing or psychologically analyzing, why you're doing the sport and how you feel about yourself. I think, sure, you can be super hard on yourself and think that that's going to give you your best result. But if you've raised a child, you realize that's not the way to treat a child, and it's not a way to treat yourself either.
Yeah,
that's how I've handled it.
No, that's a great point, because there's so many athletes who have you've heard the term like the inner critic, right? So it's kind of like that voice inside of your head that's overly critical, kind of like a authoritarian parent or something. You got to be careful with. Sometimes that lights a fire under your ass, right? And like, it really helps push you, but too much of that stuff is demoralizing if you're too hard on yourself, right?
I agree. And in this particular sport, in cycling, and it's different in different sports, but I think there's a continuing thread, is that when you really, really push yourself hard, physically, when it's uncomfortable and painful, you have to. So, for instance, to drop back for a second, when you would race with somebody that had just started a new relationship, maybe in our case, it would be one of the guy racers that met a woman or someone they're having a connection with, and they were on cloud nine. They seem to be supercharged, just on fire. And I deduced, and my theory was that, when you're feeling the pain, if it's okay, backing up even another chunk, when you're really feeling good and that you're putting out great power, the pain is positive. You look back, everyone's grimacing. You're like, I can do that again. When you're the guy behind trying to figure out, how is this guy going so hard? What kind of what kind of a feeling do you have mentally? The pain could be kind of intimidating, something to remember. So when guys would fall in love, and that's just been my personal experience, because I raced with a bunch of guys, when they would fall in love, they would have a different brain chemistry, and I noticed they could push themselves harder. And then when that leveled off, that kind of went away, So, in our sport, where there's a lot of discomfort, it's important to see where your head is. So if you're catting up and you hit the pain and you think, well, I shouldn't be here, this is intimidating, and this is a negative feeling, well, that's going to sabotage you pretty quickly and probably be self-fulfilling. Whereas if you start to feel the pain, if you can say, oh, of course, it's another level up. I knew this was coming. Hopefully you've trained and gotten yourself physically as well as mentally ready for that. But mentally, you have to understand, if that's where you want to be, what's going to be your relationship with that discomfort. And so when I catted up, I was prepared for it to be extremely difficult. And it was harder, but not harder than I expected it to be. And then when things opened up for me a little bit, and I thought, oh, I can do this, then I got a wave of confidence at that point. So I had low expectations, sort of low. I hoped for the best, but expected the worst, and went in it with a kind of a stoic attitude, and that worked for me. And so I continued. That was my approach. And as I said earlier, when you're really going bad it's one thing to think of what's my psychology after, a 2-hour event. It's another to be in a 2-month slump.
Yeah.
Dealing with it all the time, and then to enter your personal life. And of course, this is when you're making a living at it. But even if you're just full on athlete, when it's time to do your sport and you're putting everything into it, you have to understand that it's like life. Life isn't always just the best, happiest times. We go through all the vicissitudes of moods. And it's the same when you have a sport, even if it's just a hobby sport. If you're competing, when
Yeah.
you're measuring your accomplishments against other athletes, you got to get ready for the ups and the downs. And how do you handle that? And so for me, catting up, it was like it was beyond what I expected I would have. And currently, I'm going up to a higher level, so anything was gravy, right? You have low expectations, but secretly you kind of have a small idea that maybe this will work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think like just if you're an athlete, be really careful with assessing yourself so that if you're assessing your abilities during a race, for example, on the micro, and say, hey, I'm starting out and I'm not feeling good, be strong and be measured and say, well, you never know, later on in the race I might start feeling better, so I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to assess myself as feeling really bad today yet. And same thing with result after result. If you're on a hot streak, a winning streak, and you're charged with that confidence, you're inevitably going to have a bad race, just as statistically. Like you're not going to be winning forever. So it's kind of like, and if you're in a slump, you're not going to be in a slump forever. So if you think about the just if athletes are really good at assessing themselves, and that's why it's helpful to have a coach too. But it sounds like for you, you had a really good, like a stoic attitude, and were able to have like a larger perspective. If you looked at like a graph, like throughout the season, even through training, because you got slumps in training. If you could graph that out, you'd look at it on the macro and you go, hey, I'm doing well. But if you take it to the micro, like if you watch the stock market every day, right, and if you're going up and down in your emotions, that's no way to invest, right? Same thing, I think, with measuring your results. So yeah, it sounds like you had a really good attitude in terms of expectations and also being hopeful and using some of those when you were on a hot streak, you ran with it, right? But then when you were on maybe not doing well, you would just tough it out, knowing that you're going to turn it around. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you say it well. It's you can't look at the every like you get in the race and you can already tell your legs feel like if we're going to talk about bike racing, your legs are you don't have good legs. Okay, that so we finally circled around when Greg LeMond won the world championships in the second time where he beat Sean Kelly in the sprint. It's an iconic photo.
Oh, right. In 1989. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it was in Italy, maybe.
I think it was in like Switzerland or something. I can't
Well,
remember.
the one in '83 was in Switzerland, I know.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think it was somewhere else. But he said he almost dropped out. He had bad legs for the first 5 hours.
I remember that. I remember that. Yeah.
So that would be like, if you had bad legs and you were catting up, that'd be confirmation that you just didn't have the stuff
Right.
or your day. But he knew his competitors, and he knew that when he was on, he could be with them or better than them. So he just hung it out, and he almost quit. But then the last time up the climb, his legs came around, as he said, and then and not only did he hang in there, but he beat guys in the sprint, and
Yeah. I mean, he beat Sean Kelly in a sprint, which is pretty amazing. Yeah.
yeah, he could do that the same way. If we're going to talk sports specific, that's why he reminds me of Pogačar. He does the same thing. He's like a better time trialer, a better climber, but when he winds up a sprint, he just stays on it. So he's not a pure sprinter, but I wouldn't bet against him in a sprint when he's in a breakaway. And
Right.
so LeMond was the same way, but germane to our conversation, he had bad legs, but he was playing the long game. It's anecdotal, but it's kind of how you can look at that over the course of a season's efforts or during the duration of one race. And so it's informative for the same reasons, which is you don't measure yourself every minute. How am I doing right now? You have that going on as you're in your competition, but hopefully you're so focused on the other important elements of competition that you're just going to hang in there. When you're in a breakaway with a group of riders, often you can come to a point where you can sort of tell you're hanging on. The other guys seem to be pushing harder than you can, and you're suffering. But then if you're in a breakaway for hours, which can happen, it sort of changes.
Mm-hmm.
So that works in both directions, by the way. You could
Yeah.
be just killing everybody, and then we're getting towards the end of the race, and it's not, the other guys seem like they're coming around now. So, the bottom line is you just gotta, when you're in the competition, if you've done the work, you owe it to yourself to play it all the way out. You can't just like give up when it gets really painful. And the other thing about when you're really, really suffering on a really specific micro level, anything could change. If you're suffering on the wheel of another racer, and I always use cycling, but I've done other sports, you're really suffering on the wheel of another athlete and you're trying to keep their pace. You could say, oh, how can I keep this going? They're going to keep going forever. Or you could think, well, when I'm doing really great, sometimes I just throttle up and redline it a little bit and act like it isn't a big deal just to see if the other guys can hang. And maybe that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then we have the benefit of drafting, So on a climb, it's a little different, but it's the same psychology. You're just suffering next to the other people, maybe the other person, and you're thinking, all right, who's going to give in first, And if I'm honest about it, I had kind of a seminal moment when I was a kid. I went to a lot of different grade schools, and the first day of class, the bully would come over and try to pick on you, and I got like a wrestling match, like first day of class. It's one of these schools, 7 times I transferred, and I was wrestling with the guy, and all of a sudden, it was not a very friendly fight, and it wasn't on like playground pavement or something, and we got kind of into kind of a lock where it was like neither of us could get any further along with it. And I had this one voice that said, oh, I don't want to be here right now, like, what's the fastest way out of here? And I guess it would have been to just sort of surrender and let the guy pin me. But I had another voice that said, just keep breathing, keep focusing. And the minute I made that decision to just keep struggling against what seemed like an inert effort, it wasn't going to go anywhere, he gave up.
Interesting.
And I never forgot that lesson,
Yeah.
And I hit that wall, and it was like pushing against a brick wall. You feel that it's futile, but I learned it'll move. It may move. It seems immovable, but it may move. And so that's kind of been my approach to those kinds of things. I mean, there's times when somebody's just superior and they're going to beat you. But then that shifts to a different mindset, which is, okay, I'm probably going to lose, but I'm going to lose at the last possible moment here. And so it's going in and just doing the work and just staying focused during that suffering instead of, oh, I'm going to get dropped by this rider that I don't think I'm as good as. And that would be, I'd be crestfallen if that happens. And of course, in bike racing, that does happen. You can't avoid that. Just like I beat guys that were better than me, guys that weren't as good as me beat me. That's the beauty of our sport.
Yeah. No, bike racing is great in that way, and things can turn around on a dime. You never know. I really like a couple things you said there. One was, if you put in the work, you owe it to yourself to see it through to the end, right? Either to the end of the race, the end of the competition, depending on the sport, and also like to the end of the season too, because you don't really, another thing that stood out too was like, don't overestimate and don't underestimate your opponent, right? Because there can be this thing, if you're in a really hard struggle with someone like this kid on the playground, there's that one voice that is kind of like overestimating the strength of your opponent. And then there's the other voice that's like, well, what if I just hang in there a little longer? And then you get surprised because your opponent taps out, right? Because athletes can be so much in their own head and not thinking about, what, if I think there's this actually great Greg LeMond quote where he said, the time to attack is when you're hurting the most, because everybody else is hurting the most too. So it's kind of like athletes can get really in their own head and not think that the other person's actually suffering, but they are too. So I love those points of like not giving up on yourself, seeing it through to the end. You owe it to yourself to do that because you put the work in. And then also, don't underestimate or overestimate your opponent. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's well put. Well, cycling in particular can be is highly psychological. I'm sure all sports are at some level, but I'm learning to wing foil right now, and it's only a competition with myself to the extent I want to get good enough so that I can take it to the next level, and which would be to do different things on the foil. So um, the season's ending, and I really want to get better, and I progress pretty fast at this kind of thing, and then I'll have a day where I feel like definitely have gone backwards, and so I'm just flailing out there. And instead of quitting, I generally will just stay with it because I've learned you learn a lot more during that time. It's kind of like putting 10-pound ankle weights on or something, if you're going for a hike. Okay, I'm not going to be fast today, but I'm doing resistance training. So it's the same with bicycle racing and probably a lot of other sports. When you're not in the zone, if you can acknowledge that this is not going to be my day, but I'm just going to do the best I can. Don't worry about my result, and know that when my day comes, this time spent where it's just not going well is going to behoove me. So then when everything is the skids are greased, I'll have that mental toughness to just slide through it. So I'm trying to learn to do this sport, and everyone's like, wow, you're really getting good at that. And then I went out, and it was like one day I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it nearly as well, and I was just getting pummeled. And it's very windy, and the stuff's getting ripped out of your hands. Then you finally get it going, and then the foil, you fall, and you almost land on the foil, and the wing gets ripped out of your hand. And then you try to get up, and you're maybe not strong enough to get balanced the way you normally do. You can say, "Oh, I should just give up today," or you can keep going, and you become more animalistic, is how I'd say it. You have to leave your head. Everything is falling apart, so you're just becoming more natural. And at the end of the day, you flailed all the way through. But the next time or the time after that, when all your sensations are good, it's like life. It's like one of those days where you bump something when you're in a hurry. You bump something and spill it. And you go to pick it up and you drop that, and then you spill something on your shirt, and then you lose your keys. That comes in. It's going to be like that for the next hour or two, and you can say this is unjust and get really mad, or you can go, this is one of those days. I'm not in the pocket. Musicians talk about being in the groove, in the pocket. Where you can feel the other musicians and you're just in it. And it's the same in a lot of other endeavors and in life in general. And when you're not in the pocket, you have to realize I'm not in the pocket. So today's a resistance day, and I can get through it, with aplomb and, some humor, or I can just respond to it in a very reactionary way that, oh, it's not my day. I'm going to just take off my cleats or whatever the sport is and just pout or rail against your frustration. And so there were times when I was racing in Europe where I could barely walk. And when I got up and went to the breakfast, I didn't recover that well sometimes, And so it was like, we could have just started this race right after the one that we just finished yesterday, and I would feel just as bad. And I thought, well, later when my legs recover, all of this effort that I'm making where it's so excruciating, is going to seem easy. And so that was something I did do. That was a little more difficult. It was difficult with foiling too, but I had that experience in cycling as well.
Yeah, so it seems like if you have a never quit attitude, that can become a habit. So like when you're foiling and you hit that layer where your initial skills, or you don't quite have all the skills, and you have a bad day foiling, you'd say, well, this is an opportunity. So that if you say, here's some adversity I can chew on, and then when I get to a higher level, whatever sport that you're in, you're going to see that same adversity of where you're going to feel like you're going to want to quit, or the odds are really stacked against you. But I wonder, do you think that that quitting can become a habit? Let me articulate a little bit more. Like I remember seeing in the cycling world, even the high level, some athletes, or really in a lot of sports, they'll quit, or they'll announce their retirement like halfway through a season, or you can tell they still had more in them, and they reached a level of frustration, I'll call it, where they're just having a bad run and they just tap out, kind of like that kid on the playground, right? Just tapping out. And I wonder if that becomes like a habit for an athlete, meaning that never quit, never drop out, because that can become a habit. What do you think?
Well, I do believe that, in my own personal experience, there were times when I would quit. I'd realize it was futile and that I was just digging a hole, and I would do that, and it would be extremely negative. And then the problem with that is, and sometimes it's reasonable to do that. Sometimes you just don't have it. Um, Whether that's going to be, a trap door that you always fall through depends on how you handle it. Like if you make a decision, I just don't have the form. I'm not going to get stronger from doing this. Yes, I might get mentally stronger for this particular kind of grinding out of the pocket, painful situation, but I'm also going to dig a hole that's going to cost me a couple of days or weeks to recover from. Then I think it's reasonable to quit. But then you have to have a conversation with yourself at that point. All right, I did that tactically, but I also did it psychologically. And so what does that mean? I quit. Am I going to quit every time it's hard? No, I'm going to quit when it's hard. And I realize I'm just digging a hole and that it's futile. But you have to be careful because there was that element of psychologically giving up. I'm giving up now. So we can talk about it in another podcast, but the second time I made the Olympic team, I knew that it was going to be very difficult to make the team. As I was making efforts in January, February, March, April, I thought about that event and I would give a little bit of full throttle. And then just before I quit, I would go, I'll just go another few seconds. But the day will come when I'm going to have to stay in this zone that I'm going to go into right now. And I would just test it. And I go in there and I try to get comfortable. I get really, really high level of discomfort, based on where my fitness was and what I was trying to attain. And I would think, oh my God, it'd be like swimming underwater for, 10 minutes. I'm never going to be able to do it. But I wouldn't think of it that way. I think I can do this. Okay, I'm down here. I'm cruising. It's good. It's good. I'll go another 20 seconds. And then I come up for air, and I'd get dropped or whatever. But then I would race my normal season. And the next time that moment of truth would come, I'd be like, okay, let's pretend we're in the zone. We're going to stay there no matter what, no matter how much pain comes, we're going to just stay in there. And I'd stay in a little longer this time. And then I'd back out and get dropped. And I did that the whole season until the actual moment. And I can look back on it and say, I needed to have done that because I made an effort that was so excruciatingly difficult that I fooled myself into not almost feeling it. And I really tore myself up. I thought, wow, I'd run my racehorse out, put it away wet. I mean, I just tore myself apart. But the point is, the only reason I could do that is I did little increments of it. And psychologically, and then more germane to our conversation, I did quit. I mean, I did back off. Mm-hmm. But I did it tactically and I circled the loop mentally to say, okay, yeah, you did quit, but that's our plan. So there is a fine point there. You can't just go until you completely fall down. I mean, you're not going to become a better athlete and you're going to get hurt.
That's super interesting. It's almost like you were doing psychological training on yourself.
That's what all bike racing was psychological training.
No, but I mean, like intentionally, like you would say, okay, I'm going to do this race or I'm going to do this training and I'm going to intentionally push myself beyond this limit so that later I can use this as like a new habit that I'm cultivating and using that as a way to psychologically train yourself. So like you're saying, yeah, I'm going to be in this zone of beyond my capability for X amount of time. I've been here before. I know what this feels like. I can do this. Because I think that there's a lot of athletes will not have that kind of attitude in training or even in using races as training. But it sounds like you were having this idea of like, well, if I'm going to make the Olympic team, and this was in, I think, 1992, right?
Right.
Yeah. That course is not quite my style, too many hills. I'm going to have to train myself psychologically to push beyond my limit and stay in there without even thinking about giving up. And I mean, I just like the way that you did that intentionally during the season. I don't know if there's a lot of athletes that would do that intentionally.
Well, I don't know if other people have done it. I'm sure other people have done it. I think anyone can do it. But it has to be a plan, and it's a conversation. So I was talking to some guy about what he goes through his mind when he was trying to bridge a gap, something I wasn't very good at. I mean, I could zoom across, but if it was a longer gap, didn't have the physical ability. And so mentally that was tough for me, to bridge a long gap where and I asked him, well, what goes through his head? And he said he would think of his dad's suicide.
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's like the most negative thing that he could think of. In other words, he was interpreting the pain that he was experiencing in the negative realm, and I had done a little of that too. Like for me, the negative realm was I just couldn't live with myself if I gave up and if I let this person beat me. But it was still negative. It was coveting something that it was hanging on to something with a negative. So I thought, well, let's work it a different way. Let's get in that zone, but let's clean our head and, more on the meditative zone. Because what else are you going to think about? Some positive, fun thing. You can't focus on,
right.
your history or anything. You barely know your name at that point. And so I decided to do it a little more positively when I got into that. So I intentionally got into that really gritty, horrible feeling of just hanging on by a fingernail. We say in the sport on the rivet, because bicycle saddles used to be made out of leather and they would have a pop rivet at the very nose. And when you're really, really going, you kind of slide forward on the saddle, put all your body weight over the pedals, and you know all too well what I'm talking about. What's going to go through my head? And I found I had to go to just kind of like a nothingness. I did quit one time in my book. I did Snake Alley and I went way too hard and I went right off the course. I couldn't unclip. I rolled down, I fell over, and I opened my eyes and there's these little old people standing around me in the circle asking me if I was okay. I still couldn't unclip, and I was like, I quit bike racing. I was like, okay,
that's it.
obviously this is not my sport, and then on the drive home, I kind of was frustrated, and then I did a training ride and I felt a little better, and then next thing I know I was back at it. So that's normal.
That's awesome. I remember, we both remember that race. This is in Burlington, Iowa, which is, they still have it too. It's a criterium that goes up, I think, like 12 or 13 hairpin corners up cobblestones at like, I don't know, 18% or something like that. So you picked a good race to want to quit bike racing, because that's a brutal, dangerous, intense race. But like you said, you did a couple training rides afterwards, and you're like, okay, I'm back into it. I think that's a danger of making decisions, like career decisions, in the heat of the moment and giving yourself time to chill out. I think that's important. Like you said earlier, I think this really sticks out in the show today, is that if you put in the work, you owe it to yourself to stick with it and to see it out through the whole season, and maybe even through 3 more years or whatever it is. But you really owe it to yourself, because you never know what's going to happen with your competition. You could be on a winning streak for a while, but I think, Bob, that's a good place to end the podcast today. But I really want to thank you for coming on the show today. I think this is going to be helpful especially for bicycle racers listening, but really anyone in any sport. If you think about leveling up, take some nuggets from this episode and apply them. And if you got the desire and you got some talent and you really want to give it a go in your sport, like you said, you owe it to yourself to stick with it. So, Bob, thanks for coming on today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Mike, that's well put, and look forward to doing it again.
Awesome. Hey, hope you enjoyed today's episode with Bob Mionske. A lot of good stuff there for athletes, learning how to level up, the struggle of leveling up, the psychology behind it. Sports psychology is such an important thing. So many athletes can learn so much about improving in their game by learning some basics of sports psychology. If you have any ideas for other podcast shows for me to do, I'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment if you're listening on YouTube, you can DM me if you're on Instagram, or you can reach me on my website, michaelseeley.com. A lot of info about my coaching programs there, and all of my episodes for my podcast are on that site as well. Thanks for listening. Hope you all are doing great in your sport.